Picture this. The year is 1500 after Christ, and somewhere in the jagged peaks of what we now call Arizona, an Apache grandmother is teaching her granddaughter the ancient art of basket weaving. The child's fingers work the bear grass and willow shoots, while her grandmother speaks of the old stories, how first woman taught the people to make burden baskets so strong they could carry a family's entire life across endless desert miles. This isn't just craft instruction, mind you. This is survival education at its most fundamental level. Because in Apache society, women weren't just participants in the economy, they were the economy. They owned the wickiups, those ingeniously designed dwellings that could be assembled or dismantled in under an hour. They chose their husbands, and here's something that would have shocked those Spanish conquistadors still clinging to their medieval notions of marriage. An Apache woman could divorce her husband simply by placing his belongings outside their dwelling. Done, finished, next. But let's zoom out from that intimate scene of grandmother and child and look at the bigger picture. By 1500 after Christ, the Apache had built something extraordinary across the American Southwest. We're talking about a loose confederation of bands controlling trade routes that stretched from the Rio Grande to the Colorado River. Imagine an area roughly the size of modern-day France, but with terrain that makes the French countryside look like a golf course. These weren't nomadic wanderers stumbling around the desert. The Apache were master strategists who had turned lightning-fast raids and carefully calculated alliances into an art form. Think of them as the special forces of pre-Columbian America. They could appear out of nowhere, strike with devastating precision, and vanish back into mountains that they knew like we know our neighborhood streets. Their horses, descendants of Spanish stock acquired through trade and raids, gave them mobility that turned the vast southwestern landscape into their personal highway system. Now, Apache society operated on principles that would have seemed alien to European minds. Kinship systems bound clans together across territories that spanned hundreds of miles. A Chiricahua Apache woman might have relatives among the Mescalero 300 miles away, and those family connections created networks of mutual support, shared intelligence, and coordinated resistance that no European military commander fully understood. When it came to courtship, the Apache had developed rituals that were part romance, part military evaluation. Suitors didn't just bring flowers, they demonstrated hunting prowess and proved their bravery in ways that left no doubt about their ability to provide and protect. A young Apache man might spend months proving himself worthy, bringing game to a woman's family, showing his skill with weapons, and demonstrating the kind of courage that Apache survival demanded. This wasn't casual dating, this was strategic partnership. Formation for life in one of the world's most challenging environments. The women in these courtship rituals held power that would have astonished European observers. Apache daughters learned from their grandmothers not just basket weaving and food preparation, but the intricate negotiations that held Apache society together. They understood the healing properties of mesquite beans and prickly pear cactus. They memorized the complex kinship relationships that determined who could marry whom, who owed what to which clan, and how disputes should be resolved. But here's where our story takes a sharp turn. In 1845, American wagon wheels began cutting tracks across Apache lands for the first time. Imagine the scene. Dust clouds on the horizon that didn't belong to Apache riders or Mexican traders, but to something entirely new. American settlers, soldiers, and fortune seekers, carrying with them cultural assumptions about marriage, family, and women's roles that were about to collide with Apache traditions in ways nobody could have predicted. Among the Chiricahua Apache, a woman named Dos Tese watched these strange newcomers with the kind of careful attention that had kept her people alive for generations. At Fort Buchanan, she observed American soldiers with their wool uniforms that seemed designed for Pennsylvania winters rather than Arizona summers. She listened to them speak of love matches and choosing one. Wife, concepts as foreign to her as her grandmother's burden basket techniques would have been to them. These Americans talked about marriage as if it were purely about emotion, about individual choice, disconnected from clan obligations, kinship networks, or survival strategies. To Apache minds, this seemed almost incomprehensibly naive. Marriage wasn't just about personal feelings. It was about creating alliances, strengthening the band, ensuring the survival of children in a harsh landscape where one wrong decision could mean death for an entire family. But the strategic minds among Apache leaders, men like Chief Mangus Coloradas, a giant of a man standing 6 feet 4 inches tall in an era when most men barely reached 5.5 feet, these leaders saw opportunity in the cultural confusion. Mangus Coloradas initially encouraged limited interaction with the Americans, viewing them as potential allies against Mexican forces who had been raiding Apache settlements for decades. Then 1851 happened. Gold, that magical word that had the power to transform reasonable men into reckless fortune hunters and turn quiet valleys into boomtowns almost overnight. When gold was discovered in Apache territory, everything changed. The trickle of American settlers became a flood. The occasional wagon train became a constant stream of miners, merchants, and military units. And here's where our story takes its most unexpected turn. The first Apache women captured in the escalating conflicts expected death or slavery, the standard fate that Spanish and Mexican captors had dealt for centuries. Instead, something unprecedented happened. They heard marriage proposals, lonely American soldiers speaking broken Apache, offering calico dresses and promises of protection, asking these women to become their wives. Imagine the shock. Imagine the confusion. For generations, capture had meant one thing. Now these pale strangers with their strange customs were offering something that didn't fit any category Apache women had learned to expect. But was this really about love? Or were there deeper currents at work here? Strategic calculations on both sides that would reshape the entire Southwest? Because what happened next would challenge everything both cultures thought they knew about marriage, loyalty, and survival. The answer came crashing down like thunder in the mountains in 1861. Lieutenant George Bascom, fresh from West Point and armed with more confidence than common sense, made a decision that would bathe the Southwest in blood for the next 25 years. He accused Cochise, the Chiricahua Apache leader who had been trying to maintain peace, of kidnapping a rancher's child. Wrong Apache band, wrong crime, right disaster. Picture the scene. Cochise arrives at Apache Pass under a flag of truce, bringing his brother and 2 nephews for what he believes is a routine meeting. Bascom springs his trap, arresting them all. Cochise escapes by slashing through the tent wall with a knife, but his family remains imprisoned. Within hours, the most feared Apache war leader in the Southwest is painting for war, and the Bascom affair has just lit a fuse that will burn for a generation. Now here's what makes this story so remarkable. Even as Apache warriors prepared for the most devastating conflict in their history, even as American forts bristled with cannon and soldiers slept with rifles beside their beds, something extraordinary continued to happen in the shadows. Love, or at least something resembling it, kept blooming like desert flowers after rain. Take Maria Jova. In 1863, during a raid near Tucson, she found herself captured and facing what she assumed would be death or worse. Instead, she encountered Sergeant James Patterson, a man who offered her water from his own canteen and spoke gently in Spanish, the trade language of the borderlands. Here was an American soldier who didn't see her as a prize of war or a beast of burden, but as a human being deserving of basic decency. Within months, Maria Jova had become Maria Patterson. Think about the psychological journey involved here. This woman had grown up hearing stories of American brutality, had seen the aftermath of raids on both sides, had lived through the escalating cycle of revenge that was consuming the Southwest. Yet here she was, teaching her husband to track deer using Apache techniques while learning to bake bread in a cast-iron oven that probably weighed more than all her family's traditional cooking implements combined. But let's not romanticize this. These marriages weren't happening in a vacuum. Strategic minds on both sides recognized the potential advantages, and they weren't shy about exploiting them. Apache families began positioning their daughters near American settlements, understanding that a daughter married to a soldier meant access to ammunition, advance warning of patrol movements, and food during the harsh winters when traditional hunting grounds had become battlefields. The Americans caught on just as quickly. Military leaders realized that Apache wives provided intelligence networks that no army scout could match. They understood the terrain, knew the water sources, could read signs that told stories invisible to American eyes. More importantly, they could negotiate with hostile bands, serving as intermediaries in a conflict where communication often happened at rifle range. Consider the marriage of Captain John Burke to Nalin, who happened to be Victorio's cousin. This wasn't just a love match, though by all accounts it was that too. It was a diplomatic coup. When Captain Burke married Nalin in 1868, he gained access to a communication channel that prevented at least 3 potential massacres. Nalin could send word to her cousin's band about planned military movements, while Victorio could communicate his intentions through her to the army command. But imagine the impossible position these women found themselves in. Nalin would warn her husband about Apache raids, while secretly supplying her relatives with army hardtack. She lived with a foot in both worlds, loyal to a husband she had grown to love, and to a family that some Americans considered savage enemies. The psychological strain must have been enormous. The daily reality of these mixed marriages created scenes that must have seemed surreal to observers from both cultures. Picture Nalin insisting on facing east each dawn for her traditional prayers, while Captain Burke read from his Bible. She refused to sleep in their wooden bed during her monthly cycle, following Apache taboos that mystified American neighbors who saw such practices as primitive superstition. Their children became living symbols of this cultural fusion. Burke and Nalin's son learned to shoot both Army carbines and Apache bows with equal skill. He spoke English at the fort school during the day, and Apache with his grandmother, who lived in a traditional wickiup behind their military quarters in the evenings. Imagine this boy's world, 1 foot in each culture, belonging fully to neither, yet understanding both in ways that his parents never could. The sight of Apache women shopping at fort commissaries became a symbol of how much the world was changing. These women would arrive carrying traditional burden baskets woven by their grandmothers, but they filled them with army rations, calico cloth, and metal tools that represented a completely different way of life. They haggled with American merchants in Spanish, Apache, and broken English, creating a polyglot marketplace that would have been unimaginable just a decade earlier. By 1870, military records show over 200 such marriages across Arizona and New Mexico territories. Each one represented a small experiment in cultural fusion, a test of whether 2 fundamentally different ways of life could coexist within the same household. Some failed spectacularly. Divorce rates were high, and not all cultural differences could be bridged. But others succeeded in ways that surprised everyone involved. These war brides developed coping strategies that revealed remarkable adaptability. They learned to cook with new ingredients while secretly maintaining traditional food preparation methods. They adopted American dress for public occasions while preserving traditional clothing for ceremonial purposes. They navigated the complex social dynamics of military posts while maintaining connections to Apache clan networks that stretched across hundreds of miles. The Apache American households became centers of cultural exchange that went far beyond marriage. Apache wives taught their neighbors about desert survival techniques that could mean the difference between life and death. American husbands learned tracking skills that made them more effective soldiers. Children growing up in these families became natural interpreters and negotiators. their mere existence proving that accommodation was possible. But here's what nobody anticipated. These marriages were creating something entirely new. Not Apache, not American. Something different. By the 1870s, as the Apache Wars reached their bloody climax, a new generation was coming of age. Children who belonged to both worlds and to neither, who would face challenges their parents never imagined. Because what happens when your Apache grandfather is Geronimo? Your father wears an army uniform, and you're caught in the middle of the last great Indian War in American history. The 1870s brought warfare that made everything before it look like a border skirmish. Cochise had finally been driven from his Dragoon Mountain stronghold, the natural fortress where he'd held off the entire United States Army for over a decade. Victorio launched his desperate war, leading his band on a rampage that left settlements across 2 territories in terror. This was total war, the kind that left no room for neutrality, no space for divided loyalties. And yet in the midst of this carnage, Francesca Mangas sat at a wooden table in her quarters at Fort Apache, writing love letters to her cavalry officer husband while he pursued her own cousins across the desert. Think about that for a moment. This was the daughter of Mangas Coloradas, the great chief who had been murdered by American soldiers in 1863. She was married to Major William Price, the man whose job was to hunt down and kill Apache warriors who were her blood relatives. "My heart splits like lightning-struck pine," she wrote in 1872. "Loving you while my people die." These weren't just words on paper. This was a woman living through emotional torture that would have broken most people. Every morning she kissed her husband goodbye, knowing he might return with scalps of men who had played with her as a child. Every evening she welcomed him home, searching his face for signs of what he had seen, what he had done. Major Price faced his own impossible choices. When orders came down for him to participate in the Camp Grant massacre, the slaughter of 144 Apache people, mostly women and children who had been living under army protection, he refused. Think about the courage that took. In the middle of the most vicious Indian war the Southwest had ever seen, an army officer defied direct orders because his Apache wife had taught him that those victims were human beings, not just enemy casualties. But the most remarkable story of this period emerged in 1877, when something happened that defied all logic. Shikashi, Geronimo's own niece, married Lieutenant Charles Gatewood, the very officer who would later negotiate her uncle's final surrender. Let that sink in. The niece of the most feared Apache leader in history married the American officer who would ultimately end Apache resistance forever. Their courtship reads like something from a novel, except it really happened. Gatewood, one of the few American officers who spoke fluent Apache, first encountered Shikashi when he treated her brother's wounds after a skirmish. Instead of seeing an enemy, he saw a woman caring for her family. Instead of seeing an occupying soldier, she saw a man who showed mercy to the wounded. Shikashi initially refused Gatewood's marriage proposals 3 times, testing his commitment according to Apache custom. This wasn't playing hard to get. This was following protocols that had governed Apache courtship for generations. He had to prove his worthiness, not just to her, but to her clan, her family, her entire social network. In the middle of a war where her uncle was fighting for Apache survival, she was evaluating an American officer as a potential husband. Their wedding combined traditions in ways that must have seemed surreal to witnesses. Apache burden basket gifts sat alongside army dress uniforms. Traditional Apache foods were served on china plates. Her clan mothers sang blessing songs while the fort chaplain read Christian marriage vows. Imagine the psychological complexity for everyone involved. Apache women blessing a marriage to an enemy soldier, American officers celebrating a union with the family of their most dangerous adversary. These marriages produced children who embodied the contradictions of their time. James K. Wakeler, son of an Apache mother and American trader father, could recite both Apache creation stories and Shakespeare sonnets by age 12. He learned to track deer using techniques passed down through generations of Apache hunters, but he also studied mathematics using textbooks shipped from Boston. His very existence challenged every stereotype both cultures held about the other. Maria Patterson's daughter Anna became the first Apache American woman to graduate from Carlisle Indian School, that controversial institution designed to kill the Indian and save the man. But instead of abandoning her Apache heritage, she returned to Arizona and established schools that taught both English and Apache languages. She understood that survival meant adaptation, not surrender. The psychological journey of these war brides reveals itself through their actions rather than their words. Women who initially flinched at their husband's touch, conditioned by years of warfare to expect violence from American men, gradually learned to trust, then to love. They defended their marriages before suspicious Apache relatives who saw them as traitors and hostile American townspeople who viewed them as savages. By 1880, these Apache American families had created an informal diplomatic network that operated beneath the official channels of war. When tensions escalated, war brides served as early warning systems. When negotiations were needed, they provided trusted intermediaries. They negotiated everything from water rights to grazing permits, creating a parallel system of frontier diplomacy that military commanders learned to rely on. Consider the complexity of their daily lives. An Apache war bride might spend her morning teaching her American neighbors how to identify edible desert plants, knowledge that could save lives during shortages. In the afternoon, she might receive coded messages from Apache relatives about troop movements. In the evening, she would sit with her husband as he planned patrols against those same relatives. The mental gymnastics required to navigate these competing loyalties would have challenged anyone. The children of these unions faced unique pressures that their parents couldn't fully understand. Apache kids threw stones at them, calling them white eyes and traitors. American children taunted them as savages and half-breeds. They belonged fully to neither world, yet they possessed insights into both cultures that made them invaluable as interpreters, negotiators, and bridge builders. But here's what makes this story even more remarkable. Instead of being crushed by these pressures, many of these families thrived. They developed economic strategies that combined Apache knowledge with American business practices. They created educational approaches that preserved traditional wisdom while embracing new opportunities. They built social networks that transcended the artificial boundaries imposed by warfare. The war brides themselves evolved from victims of circumstance into agents of change. They weren't passive recipients of fate. They were active participants in creating a new kind of frontier society. By the early 1880s, as Geronimo's final campaign approached its climax, these women had established themselves as essential members of both communities. Proof that even the most bitter conflicts couldn't completely destroy the human capacity for adaptation and love. But Geronimo's surrender in 1886 would test these families in ways they never anticipated. Because what happens when the war officially ends, but the cultural conflicts continue? What happens when your mixed heritage children must find their place in a world that no longer has room for warriors, but hasn't yet learned to accept the possibility that Apache and American might be the same person? September 4th, 1886. Geronimo's final surrender at Skeleton Canyon marked the official end of Apache military resistance. But for the families we've been following, it marked the beginning of an entirely new chapter. At Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where Geronimo's band was imprisoned as prisoners of war, his niece, Shikashi, gave birth to twin daughters who would grow up in a world their grandparents could never have imagined. Picture this scene. These little girls calling the most feared war leader in American history grandfather, while their father commanded the very fort garrison that kept him imprisoned. Geronimo, the man who had terrorized the Southwest for decades, teaching his great nieces traditional Apache stories while their father taught them to read English. This wasn't reconciliation. This was something entirely new. a family structure that existed outside all previous categories. These children faced challenges that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations. Apache kids on the reservation threw stones at them, calling them white eyes and accusing them of betraying their heritage. American children in nearby towns taunted them as savages and half-breeds, refusing to accept them as equals. They were too Apache for white society, too American for traditional Apache society, forced to create their own identity in the spaces between worlds. But here's what nobody anticipated. Instead of being crushed by these pressures, many of these mixed families began to thrive in ways that stunned both communities. By 1900, Apache American ranching families controlled over 300,000 acres across the Southwest. They had turned their unique position, understanding both cultures, trusted by neither, into an economic advantage that their parents' generation could never have imagined. Sam Hyozus exemplified this transformation. Son of an Apache mother and American father, he built the largest freight company between El Paso and Tucson by combining Apache knowledge of water sources and seasonal patterns with American business practices and capital investment. His drivers followed routes that avoided the seasonal floods and drought zones that destroyed his competitors. His company succeeded because it operated according to principles both cultures understood: reliability, knowledge of the land, and fair dealing. Hyozus employed both Apache horsemen who could track a lost wagon train across 50 miles of desert and American drivers who understood railroad schedules and shipping contracts. His success came from recognizing that survival in the new Southwest required skills from both traditions. He spoke Apache with his employees, English with his customers, and Spanish with everyone in between, embodying the multilingual reality of the borderlands. The daughters of war brides faced different but equally complex challenges. They had grown up watching their mothers navigate impossible loyalties, learning to code switch between cultures as naturally as changing clothes. Many became teachers, nurses, and interpreters, professions that allowed them to serve both communities while building careers that previous generations of Apache women couldn't have imagined. Anna Patterson, daughter of the war bride Maria Patterson we met earlier, established the first bilingual education program in Arizona Territory in 1895. Her schools taught Apache children to read and write in both English and Apache, preserving traditional stories and oral histories while preparing students for success in American society. She understood that cultural preservation and adaptation weren't contradictory goals, they were survival strategies. The initial disbelief that had characterized these marriages, Apache women, shocked to receive proposals instead of death sentences, had transformed into multi-generational sagas of adaptation and success. Grandchildren of war brides were attending universities, entering professions, and assuming leadership roles that would have been unthinkable when their grandmothers first encountered American soldiers. Charles Stevens, grandson of an Apache war bride, became Arizona's first Native American federal judge in 1922. His appointment represented more than personal achievement. It symbolized the possibility that mixed heritage Americans could claim full citizenship in both their ancestral and adopted societies. He presided over cases involving water rights, land disputes, and criminal matters that often required understanding both traditional Apache law and American legal precedents. Maria Rope, another granddaughter of a war bride, pursued a different path that was equally remarkable. She preserved over 3,000 Apache stories, songs, and oral histories while earning a doctorate from Columbia University in 1928. Her work ensured that traditional Apache knowledge survived the transition from warrior society to reservation life, from oral tradition to written record. She proved that academic achievement and cultural preservation could reinforce rather than undermine each other. The economic success of these families created ripple effects throughout both communities. Apache American ranches became models of sustainable land use, combining traditional knowledge of desert ecosystems with modern agricultural techniques. Their success challenged stereotypes on both sides. Apache skeptics who viewed any accommodation with Americans as betrayal, and American prejudices that viewed Native Americans as incapable of economic progress. Modern descendants of these unions gather each year at Fort Apache, sharing family histories that began with captured women's amazement at being courted rather than killed. These reunions reveal the full complexity of their heritage. They feature both Apache crown dances and American square dancing, burden basket demonstrations alongside barbecue cook-offs, traditional storytelling in Apache, followed by country music in English. These gatherings represent more than nostalgia. They demonstrate that the most unlikely marriages can forge the strongest futures. Children who grew up translating between their Apache grandmothers and American fathers became natural diplomats. Teenagers who faced rejection from both communities developed resilience and adaptability that served them throughout their lives. Adults who learned to navigate competing cultural expectations became leaders. In fields ranging from education to business to politics, the war bride's legacy lives in the 21st century through descendants who serve as tribal leaders, military officers, teachers, and healers. They include Apache leaders who use traditional ecological knowledge to manage natural resources, and American military officers who draw on ancestral warrior traditions in modern conflicts. They are living proof that cultural mixing, despite its challenges, can create something stronger than either tradition alone. When we look back at those first Apache women who heard marriage proposals instead of death sentences, we see the beginning of a story that continues today. Their initial disbelief gave way to strategic calculation, then to genuine affection, and finally to multi-generational success that neither culture could have achieved alone. They proved that love, whether romantic, familial, or simply human, really can conquer centuries of warfare, but only when it's backed by courage, adaptability, and the stubborn refusal to let others define the limits of possibility. Their story reminds us that the most profound changes often begin not with grand treaties or military victories, but with individual human beings choosing to see enemies as potential partners, strangers as possible family, and differences as opportunities rather than threats. In the end, these Apache war brides didn't just survive the collision of cultures, they created a new culture entirely, one that continues to evolve and thrive more than a century after their first tentative steps into an uncertain future.